Hi, I'm Jillian, the quilter behind This Mountain Life. What is quilting fabric? It's nearly always cotton, which is a natural fiber, meaning it's grown from a plant rather than manufactured in a factory. That's important because with quilting, it's really vital that our fabrics hold up. We want these to be heirloom items that our family uses and can hang on to for years to come. So we need to use material that is made for this purpose, meaning that it can be washed, that it's easy to cut, and it's easy to sew. Perhaps the most important thing to know about quilting cotton is the way that it's made. It is woven together by vertical and horizontal threads called the warp and the weft. The warp threads run vertically, the weft threads run horizontally. I'm actually going to show you an example that might make that a little bit more clear. This is a piece of cheesecloth. Now, cheesecloth is also woven just like a fabric, but it's more often found in the kitchen or other craft projects rather than sewing. You can see it's incredibly porous. It's a very loose weave, which allows us to see those warp and weft threads really clearly. So I've got vertical threads and horizontal threads, and that's what's holding this together. Just like our quilting cotton, this edge is very likely to fray. But let's just pretend that this is our quilting cotton, and we're going to cut it into some smaller pieces for our quilt. So it's usually pretty obvious if you need to straighten up this first edge, and this is cheesecloth, so it's very loose and it's going to get kind of messy. But usually the first thing that you do with cotton is straighten up the right side edge, assuming that you're right-handed and are going to hold your cutter in your right hand. So now we have a nice straight edge. We can see already how that is going to be much easier to cut. But let's say, for example, that we don't have our fabric lined up quite right. Let's say it's a little bit crooked and those edges aren't overlapping. Okay, now if we were, say, to cut a 3-inch piece of this cheesecloth, you can see how the fact that it was not straight has led this to be all wonky. And if you were to cut off another square and sew that into your quilt, it's going to be crooked. So that's ultimately why we need to make sure that our fabric is laying nice and straight before we cut it, so that the grain is quite vertical and horizontal and not crooked. Now that we understand how quilting cotton is made and what the grain is, let's look at a couple other key terms that you probably hear a lot. We'll look at the selvage edge and what on the bias means. The selvage or selvage edge runs along one length of the fabric. So this is where the fabric was cut to create the piece that I ordered. This edge has never been cut. It is what we consider finished, meaning that it will not fray. You can see there's some little baby threads here right on the end, but I'm pulling on them, they're not coming loose. Unlike this side, this is again where that fabric was cut to fulfill my order, and you can see these threads will pull right off or fray. Now the selvage, we don't actually want to sew with. Because it has been manufactured in such a way that it won't fray, that makes it unsuitable for our quilt. In fact, it has a series of little holes punched in it. Again, that's part of the manufacturing process, but we don't want that to be visible in our quilt. So as we're cutting out, we assume that that selvage is going to be cut off, and that's never included in a measurement in a quilt pattern. Some selvages have very useful information, like this print. Right along the selvage, we can see the name of the manufacturer, the name of the collection, the designer, the year that it was produced, of course, some copyright information, and then the manufacturer's website. It also has some color information, which can be very useful to us. These little dragonflies, or maybe they're bees, represent the different colors that are in the pattern. So we could use these little swatches to pick out solids or blenders or other fabrics that we're going to pair with this print to make sure that they are going to coordinate really well. Regardless, we're still going to cut this off before we sew it into a quilt. Now, you're welcome, of course, to just throw that away. Some sewists like to keep these and sew them together to make other projects, add them to a scrapbook, etc. Fabric that needs to be cut on the bias sometimes gets a little bit of a bad rap around quilting. On the bias simply means fabric that is cut diagonally across the grain in addition to just being cut along the grain. So this was a square of fabric cut on grain just like you normally would expect, and then I cut it diagonally right across the middle. This new edge is on the bias. It's at 45 degrees from the grain. Now, the reason that this is sometimes intimidating is because a bias edge is much more delicate than an edge along the grain. What do I mean by that? Well, this edge on the grain, you can see I'll just tug on this gently. It doesn't move too much, more or less holds its shape. But if I tug in the same way on a bias, look how much more it wants to turn and become wavy. So the concern with fabric that's cut on the bias is that it will stretch and distort out of its shape. And instead of having a nice flat piece of fabric, you'll get a little wave along that edge that will make it harder to piece together and might create some wrinkles in your quilt. Let's look at this a little closer with our cheesecloth example. All right, here's a nice square of our cheesecloth. Again, much more delicate and porous than a normal quilting fabric. But nonetheless, you can see the grain running vertically and horizontally, and this is a pretty stable edge. I'm tugging at that with some force, and it's really not going anywhere. Okay, let's cut this on the bias and see what we get. When you're making a bias cut, this is not going to be very even because it is cheesecloth, but typically a ruler that you're using will have a 45-degree line. And if you put that along the grain line edge of your fabric and then cut straight across, you've just cut on the bias. 45-degree angle. All right, let's look at that again. Here's that bias cut, and you can see how we've severed all of these little threads that normally wouldn't have been cut along that angle. So that's what's really breaking down the stability of the piece of fabric and making it more delicate. So if I tug on this in the same way, look at that. It just wants to fall apart. Now that will not happen to your quilting fabric, but I hope that helps you understand why the bias cut is more difficult. But don't let that stop you. As long as you know what you're working with, and you do now, there is nothing to be afraid of. When you're working with these bias cut fabrics, go back to our regular quilting fabric now, just be mindful of that edge. And if you are concerned about it, I like to press these before I cut them with a little bit of spray starch just to give it a little more stability. I hope you found this tutorial helpful in your quilting practice. Ask your questions in the comments. I'll do my best to help, and subscribe for our next video.